All right, let's dive into another deep dive. We've gotten a bunch of requests from listeners to take a closer look at the possible link between mercury and Alzheimer's disease, and well, we're here to do just that.
It's definitely a topic that's generating a lot of buzz in the scientific community.
Absolutely. And at the center of a lot of this research is Dr. Boyd Haley. Now, for those who aren't familiar with his work, he's a chemist who's dedicated years to studying the effects of toxic metals, especially mercury.
His work is really fascinating because he's proposing that mercury, not aluminum, like many people used to think, could be a major culprit behind Alzheimer's disease.
It's a bold claim for sure.
It is, but he's not just throwing out theories. Dr. Haley actually developed a technique called nucleotide photoaffinity labeling to see how molecules interact in the brain.
That sounds pretty high tech.
It is. And this method allowed him to compare healthy brains to those affected by Alzheimer's, and, well, the results were pretty eye-opening.
So what were some of the key differences he found?
One of the most striking discoveries was that in Alzheimer's brains, the activity of an enzyme called creatine kinase is almost completely shut down. We're talking a 98% reduction.
98%. That's a massive drop. Now, remind me, what exactly does creatine kinase do?
It's basically the energy supplier for brain cells. Without it, those cells struggle to function properly. Think of it like trying to power a city with a barely functioning power plant. Things would start to go haywire pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, I can see how that would be a big problem. So mercury disrupts the brain's energy supply, but is that the extent of the damage?
Oh, not even close. Dr. Haley's research also revealed that mercury interferes with tubulin, a protein that's essential for maintaining the structure of brain cells.
So, like the scaffolding that holds everything together.
Exactly. And in Alzheimer's brains, the scaffolding is compromised, with tubulin function being inhibited by over 80%.
So it's not just the energy supply that's disrupted, but the actual integrity of the brain cells themselves. That's scary stuff.
It is, and this damage to tubulin is linked to another hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, those neurofibrillary tangles.
Right, the tangles. We've heard about those before. But how does mercury cause them?
Well, those tangles are primarily made up of a protein called tau, and mercury messes with this protein, causing it to clump together and form those tangles, which further disrupt brain function. It's like a transportation system getting all clogged up, leading to communication breakdowns throughout the brain.
So mercury seems to be attacking the brain on multiple fronts, hindering energy production, weakening the structure of brain cells, and creating these disruptive tangles. What was the reaction from the scientific community when Dr. Haley presented these findings?
At the time, the prevailing theory was that aluminum was the main culprit in Alzheimer's. But Dr. Haley's research really challenged that assumption. He tested a variety of heavy metals and discovered that mercury was the only one that could replicate the same damage seen in the brains of Alzheimer's patients.
So this was a pretty game-changing discovery.
It really was, and it raises a critical question. If mercury is playing such a significant role, where is it coming from? We all have some level of mercury in our bodies, but what are the sources of exposure that we should be most concerned about?
That's a really important question, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear the answer.
Absolutely. We'll dive into those potential sources of mercury exposure after a quick break.
Stay with us. So we've established that Dr. Haley's research is pointing towards mercury as a possible major contributor to Alzheimer's disease, and I think it's safe to say we all have some level of mercury in our bodies, so where is that coming from?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Figuring out the sources of mercury exposure, that's key if we want to understand the risks and how to minimize them.
Exactly. And you mentioned that we'd be talking about those sources, so let's dive in. What are some of the common ways people are exposed to mercury?
Well, one that often catches people off guard is dental amalgam fillings, those silver-colored fillings that have been used for decades.
Ah, yes, the classic silver fillings. I remember having a few of those as a kid. What's the connection with mercury, though?
You might be surprised to know that those fillings are about 50% mercury. And while they've been a staple in dentistry for a long time, there's been an ongoing debate about their safety.
Wow, 50% mercury. I had no idea it was that much. Should people with those fillings be worried?
It's tough to say for sure. The research is still kind of evolving. Some studies have shown a link between amalgam fillings and higher mercury levels in the body, but correlation doesn't always mean causation, right?
That's a good point. It sounds like more research is needed, but in the meantime, it's good to be aware of the potential connection. What about other sources of mercury exposure?
Fish, particularly certain types of fish, are another significant source. While fish can be a healthy part of a balanced diet, some species tend to accumulate higher levels of mercury from their environment.
I've heard about that. Which types of fish should we be most careful about?
The ones that are higher up on the food chain, like larger predatory fish, tuna, swordfish, king mackerel, shark, those are known to have higher mercury levels.
So it's kind of like the bigger the fish, the more mercury it's likely to have.
Exactly. It's a process called biomagnification, where mercury concentrations actually increase as you move up the food chain.
Makes sense. So we've got dental fillings and certain types of fish. Any other big sources of mercury exposure to be aware of?
Yeah, there's one more we should talk about. Environmental pollution, specifically from coal-fired power plants. These plants release mercury into the atmosphere, and it can travel really far and eventually end up in our water and soil.
So even if we're careful about our dental fillings and fish consumption, we could still be exposed through the environment.
That's the thing about mercury. It can be tough to avoid completely, but don't worry, there are things we can do to minimize our exposure.
Okay, good. So what are some practical steps that listeners can take to protect themselves?
Well, we've already touched on being mindful of fish choices and considering alternative to amalgam fillings. But there are other everyday things to think about too, like some fluorescent light bulbs, certain thermometers, and even some types of batteries can contain mercury. It's important to dispose of those things properly.
Makes sense. So being mindful of everyday products and disposing of them correctly can help. What about those bigger systemic issues you mentioned, like the emissions from power plants? Is there anything we can do about those?
Definitely. Supporting stricter regulations on industrial emissions and pushing for investments in cleaner technologies can make a huge difference in reducing overall mercury pollution.
Sounds like tackling this problem involves both individual actions and larger scale changes.
Exactly. It's all about raising awareness, making informed choices, and advocating for a cleaner, healthier environment. Now, before we move on from the topic of mercury, I think it's important to touch upon one more crucial aspect of Dr. Haley's work, the solution he's proposing for mercury toxicity.
Oh, right. We were going to talk about that. Let's hear about it. What does Dr. Haley suggest we do about all of this mercury? Welcome back to our deep dive. Before the break, we were about to hear about Dr. Haley's proposed solution for mercury toxicity. I have to say, I'm really impressed that he didn't just stop at identifying the problem. He went on to actually develop a potential solution.
That's one of the things that makes his work so compelling. He didn't just raise the alarm bell, he actually rolled up his sleeves and got to work on finding a way to address the issue. And that solution is a compound called emeramide.
Emeramide. Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about this emeramide and how it works.
So emeramide also goes by the name NBMI, and it's specifically designed to bind to mercury in the body. Basically, it acts like a magnet for mercury, attracting and latching onto those mercury molecules.
Interesting. So it's like a targeted cleanup crew for mercury.
Yeah.
But what happens once emeramide is latched onto the mercury? How does it actually get rid of it?
Well, once emeramide binds to mercury, they form a stable complex that can then be safely excreted from the body, primarily through the stool. It's like escorting the mercury out of the body, so to speak.
So it's like a garbage truck picking up the mercury and hauling it away. It's
Ah,
pretty clever. So is this emeramide something that's available now? Can people who are concerned about their mercury levels just go out and get it?
that would be great, wouldn't it? Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. While emeramide has shown a lot of promise in early clinical trials, it's not readily available just yet. It's still going through the whole drug development and approval process, which, as you can imagine, takes quite a bit of time.
Yeah, I get it. Those things don't happen overnight.
Yeah.
But I have heard something about emeramide receiving some special designation or status. What's that all about?
You're probably thinking of the orphan drug designation that emeramide has been granted both in the US and the EU.
Yes,
Uh,
that's it. What exactly does that mean, though? Orphan drug designation. It sounds kind of, I don't know, mysterious.
It might sound a bit obscure, but it's actually a pretty straightforward concept. It's basically a special status that's given to drugs that are meant to treat rare diseases. And with that designation comes a bunch of benefits and incentives that are designed to encourage the development of these drugs. It's because often these drugs face unique challenges when it comes to things like research funding and market size.
So it's a way of recognizing the importance of these drugs and helping to pave the way for their development, even if they might not be blockbusters in the traditional sense.
Exactly. And in the case of emeramide, this designation really highlights its potential in addressing mercury toxicity as a possible contributing factor to a range of health issues, including Alzheimer's.
This has been an incredibly informative deep dive. Dr. Haley's research has really opened up a whole new way of looking at Alzheimer's disease and the role that mercury might play. It's also encouraging to know that there are potential solutions, like emeramide being developed, even if it's not available just yet.
I agree. And I think it underscores just how powerful scientific inquiry can be. It's all about continually exploring new avenues for understanding and treating complex diseases.
Hmm.
And Dr. Haley's work is a great example of that in action.
Absolutely. So to all our listeners out there, remember that knowledge is power. By being aware of the potential risks associated with mercury and taking steps to minimize your exposure, you can really take charge of your health. And who knows, maybe Dr. Haley's work will lead to a future where Alzheimer's disease is no longer the threat it is today. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive.